Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Eugenia Mitchelstein is Associate Professor and Director of the Department of Social Sciences at Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina and co-director of the Center for the Study of Media and Society, also in Argentina. Facundo Suenzo, a graduate student at Northwestern and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Eugenia in just a minute. I'm delighted to note that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Program, and the Latina and Latino Studies Program. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and institutions' history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly about how the seminar will unfold. First, Facundo will tell us more about Eugenia's research and career in just a minute. Then she will deliver her seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar, at any point in time during the talk. Facundo will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Facundo, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Pablo, and hello, everyone. I'm incredibly honored to have been invited in today's seminars to introduce my dearest and admired mentor and friend, Professor Eugenia Mitchelstein, and to co-moderate this very promising presentation at the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Professor Mitchelstein is Associate Professor and Director of the Department of Social Sciences at the Universidad de San Andrés, Argentina. She's also the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Media and Society in Argentina, together with Pablo Boczkowski. Eugenia Mitchelstein has a degree in political science from the Universidad de Buenos Aires, a master in science in media and communication from the London School of Economics and Political Science, University of London. She then obtained a PhD in media, technology, and society from Northwestern University. She has been awarded the Chevening Scholarship to pursue her studies in the United Kingdom and the Dissertation Improvement Grant from the National Science Foundation of the United States, among other awards. Professor Mitchelstein's research focuses on the intersection between political participation and discussion and digital culture. She has co-authored 2 books, 1 edit volume, several books chapters, and an extensive selection of journals articles and conference papers. Her latest upcoming book, co-authored with Pablo Boczkowski, The Digital Environment, How We Live, Learn, Work, and Play Now, edited by MIT Press, offers a new way to understand the role of the digital in our daily lives, calling on us to turn our attention from our disparate devices and apps to the array of artifacts and practices that make up the digital environment that envelops every aspect of our social experience. As part of her professional service to the academic community, Professor Mitchelstein is co-founder and affiliate of the Latinx and Latin Media Pre-Conference at the International Communication Association. Due to her experience, she also serves as journal reviewer for top venues in the field and as member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Press Politics and Digital Journalism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mitchelstein.
Thank you very much, Facundo, and Pablo and Mora for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back, if at least virtually, to my alma mater, Northwestern. I spent very productive and joyful years in Evanston, and I hope we can get together for a beer and barbecue on the Lake Michigan shore soon. It is an honor to participate in a seminar organized by my former dissertation advisor and present friend and colleague, Pablo Bukowski, and hosted by my former undergraduate students, present friends and colleagues, Mora Matasi and Facundo Sonso. Without much further ado, and because I'm very happy about being here, I'm gonna start my presentation. I apologize if my English is a little rusty. It's been a few years since I was in the United States, and I hope I'll be back soon. I'm gonna share my screen now. So I was interested in women and the media since I was interested in the media. And I'm going to show a few images, illustrations of the state of women and the media in Argentina. This is very slowly changing, but the fact that these illustrations are for the past 2 years suggests that it is not changing as fast as we could think, or we would think it was changing. This is a bot from Twitter that counts the number of op-eds published in major newspapers in Argentina. As you can see, the last time the bot worked, which was December 2020, 4 months ago, less 10% of the major op-eds in major newspapers in Argentina were written by women. So it's 10%, 1 in 10 of the major op-eds in major newspapers were written by women. This is an image, this was seen on the street, and it was also posted on social media of the relaunching of a very traditional radio in Argentina, Radio Rivadavia. This radio has, I think, 80 years old, is 80 years old. And as you can see, it hired all men for its programming. There are no female journalists in this radio. And if there are female journalists, they don't choose to spotlight them in their advertisements. So this is a relaunching of the programming, and they're all men. So you can see their beards and their mustaches, and there are bald men, and there are men with hair, but there are no women at all. And this is also a new cable news channel. It's owned by the newspaper La Nación. It's called La Nación Más, La Nación Plus. And this is a primetime news show. And as you can see, they always invite one woman. So there are always men discussing the news and talking about the news, and they always make sure they have one woman. So yes, there are women, but there's only one per table. Like that's the maximum they can have. And I watch this show, and I watch this cable news channel, and I find it very strange that only one woman gets to give her opinion. So she's there, but she's only one. And this is a tweet from 4 years ago. Maria O'Donnell, she's a very well-known journalist in Argentina, and this was an advertisement too by Diario Clarín, which is the top-selling print newspaper in Argentina, which said, Clarín can give you the best political and business information. And as you can see, they're all men journalists there. They're all male journalists. Maria O'Donnell saw this advertisement. She took a picture. This is a picture she took herself. It was a print newspaper ad. And she said, it appears that no woman in Clarín can give you the best political and business information. So she was sufficiently angry about this that she posted a tweet about this. And then Clarín republished the ad with one woman again. So like the one woman that is allowed to give her opinion on politics and business in Clarín. But it was still one woman. She was like put on the side. So I was interested in women and the media, but it became like a research interest for me, or a research project. I think it was 2016. I was teaching political communication at Universidad de San Andrés. And one of my students, Victoria Andelsman, said, I want to do my senior thesis on how print newspapers cover women's human rights issues such as violence against women and sexual and reproductive rights. And I said, that's great. What are you planning to do? I'm planning to do like a historical content analysis from 1995 to 2015. And I said, you'll see that everything will change, that coverage will have changed, that things will have changed in newspapers. And she said, okay, we'll see. And no, as I show in a little while, things didn't change at all, or they changed very little. And we decided to write a paper about that. And then we were interested in this topic, and we thought, who is writing the news? Who gets bylines in newspapers, and why hasn't this changed? We were in another data collection project with Pablo Bokoski. We're collecting data from 8 major news sites in Argentina, and we had the sufficient news stories to see who was writing the stories. So we did a content analysis on that. I'd like to thank, of course, Victoria and also Pablo, but also Paloma Ettenberg, Marina Weinstein, Tomás Bombau, who worked on the content analysis for this paper on bylines in main news sites in Argentina. And once we finished the byline paper, we thought, okay, so men get more bylines, as I'm going to show in a little while, but who gets to be cited as a source? Who is a source? Maybe women are cited as sources. The answer is not surprising. I'm going to show it in a little while. And the fourth paper I'm going to draw on for this presentation is a project which we finished a very short while ago with Pablo Bokoski and Facundo Suenzo, who is hosting too. We were interested in how women relate to mainstream media, and particularly to print newspapers in Argentina. We had 158 interviews, in-depth interviews, and we had a survey that suggested that fewer women read the print newspaper than men, and we wanted to know why. And that's the fourth paper I'm going to draw on. Of course, I'd like to thank all of them: Victoria, Pablo, Facundo, and the Paloma, Marina, and Tomás, who worked on these papers with me, and who allows us to have like a picture of women as topics, women as bylines, women as sources, and women as readers of mainstream media in Argentina. So as you can see, we have Clarín and Página 12, which are very well-known print newspapers in Argentina. And we had 466 articles from these selected years. Coverage of violence against women increased, yet coverage of sexual and reproductive health did not. It's constant throughout these 2 decades, which is interesting because during these 2 decades, there was a law passed about sexual education in schools, and there were several attempts to legalize abortion. None of them were successful until 2020, where abortion was legalized in Argentina finally. But what did increase was coverage of sexual violence against women in Argentina, and wanted to know, well, what's the coverage like? How is it framed? And sadly, we found that most of the articles about violence against women had no equality frame. They were not framed in terms of gender equality. And most of them were framed, used an episodic frame, not a thematic frame that allowed readers to think what were the causes and what were the consequences, and what was the social frame which allowed violence against women to happen, to be carried out. And this is an example. This is the print cover of Clarín newspaper, and the article about a man who killed his wife and his 2 children and then committed suicide is romanticized. So it's a story of madness, horror, madness, and death. Página 12 used a more precise, I'd say, headline, which is he killed his ex-wife and 2 children and committed suicide. So until I'd say 10 or 15 years ago, violence against women was called like passion crimes in Argentina. Like crimen pasional was the word they used. That is no longer used, but the idea of passion crime remains in this headline about this triple murder and suicide, which was what it was. So lack of information about sexual and reproductive health is detrimental for women's rights to autonomy in exercising life choices. So portrayal of violence against women as isolated cases where only individuals are held responsible allows for common sense notion that aggressors are monsters. They are madmen, and it's madness what leads them to carry out these horrific acts. and not a product of patriarchy and rape culture. So what's changed from 95 to 2015? Very little. And we wanted to know why, what had so little change. So we're interested in who got bylines in the news, who gets to write the news, and who gets to get credit, not only write them, but get credit for writing them. So we did a content analysis of more than 3,000 articles on 8 mainstream news sites in Argentina, 6 associated with newspapers, 1 with the top-rated cable news channel, and 1 with the top online news sites, Infobae. And we looked into bylines across news sites, beats, and type of article too. So maybe women got more kind of bylines, I don't know, in I would say soft focus stories or in education stories, that kind of thing. We didn't know, but we wanted to check. This is what we found. What's interesting is that most articles in online news sites don't have a byline. So 8 out of 10 articles don't have a byline. In the 2 per 10 that get a byline, so it's the proportion is men get double the bylines than women. So 13% of the articles had byline by a man compared to only 6% of the articles that have byline by a woman. In opinion cases, the proportion is even starker. So if in general, counting all the articles, 1 out of 3 stories with bylines were authored by women, the proportion drops to 1 in 6 in opinion articles. So this was not surprising considering the statistic I showed you at the beginning, that 10% of the op-eds in major newspapers were written by women. This is indeed slightly more, so it's 1 out of 6, but it's still very little articles written about women. Some research, and this is very preliminary research, shows that women make up 1/3 of the newsrooms in Argentina. So even if the general articles reflect the makeup of the newsroom, so 1/3 of the women newsrooms are made up by 1/3 of women, the proportion of bylines in opinion pieces does not reflect at all the makeup of newsrooms in Argentina, because of course there are more than 1 out of 6 journalists who are female in newsrooms in Argentina in general. We ran a regression to see what was the probability that articles would have a female byline. And for instance, if an article is an opinion article, an op-ed, there's a decrease, 65% decrease in the probability that it's written by a woman. If it's about politics, there's a 74% decrease in the probabilities that it's written by a woman. If it's about sports, there's 100% decrease in the probabilities that it's written by a woman. And if it's about crime, policing, that kind of thing, there's an 87% decrease in the probabilities that it's written by a woman. So this is not the same across all articles. Probabilities are significant only for opinion and politics, sports, and crimes. And as you can see here, feature style articles which have a softer focus are more there's no statistical difference in the probability they're written by a man or a woman. But apparently politics, sports, crime, and opinion are very like male-dominated areas of newsrooms in which men get to write about them, have a say, and also be credited for what they write, of course, because we don't know who is writing the articles that don't have a byline. But if it's women, they're not getting their credit for their work. This, of course, reinforces inequality, gender biases in the distribution of bylines and beats, reproduces gender inequality by limiting women's access to prestigious areas of journalism, like politics, opinion writing. Those are prestigious and they're very sought after areas of journalism in Argentina. And by reinforcing gender-based expectations of what women can and should do. So they can write feature style articles, but they can't write opinion articles, so they can to a much lesser extent. The gender byline gap also contributes to gender inequality by cultivating the idea that women do not belong in opinion pages and political journalism. And also, and this is important in a country such as Argentina, in which journalists are paid very little and increasingly they're paid less. A lot of journalists, I'd say, round up their income by participating in cable news or radio, as I showed. And it's not, I'd say, casual or a coincidence that there are much fewer women in cable news and in radio in Argentina. So when a journalist becomes well known in online journalism or in print journalism, he's usually invited to have like his own television show or to participate as a columnist in a television show or in a radio show. And of course, because women are less visible, because they get to have fewer bylines, they're less invited to this kind of show, so they are not earning, their income suffers, their income and their visibility and the kind of recognition they are awarded suffers as a consequence of not being allowed or not being invited to have a byline and to express their opinions on politics, sports, and crime. So this is like a double discrimination. Not only we don't get women like writing out politics or having an opinion out issues, but they also they lose spaces in other media because they are not they are less present in online media. So maybe women are not don't get as much bylines as men do, but they are still cited in the news. So maybe male journalists who get bylines cite a lot of women, cite a lot of women. So our third paper, the third paper I'm presenting here, leads to who is cited as a source in news, who gets to be cited as a source. As you know, sources are supposed to be authoritative. They know what they are talking about. They are experienced of what they are talking about. And this is a picture. I'm sorry for the quality of the photo. I took it myself. I was very angry. I only get the print newspapers on Sunday, which is very characteristic of what happens in Argentina, maybe other countries too. And this is a page of the newspaper that was entirely about the legalization of abortion. Legalization of abortion, which has been a demand of women in Argentina since the return of democracy in 1983, was only discussed for the first time in Congress in 2018, and it didn't pass. And it was discussed again in December 2020, and it passed. It was a very good time for feminist movement in Argentina. But in 2018, when it was starting to be discussed, La Nación newspaper, which is the second selling newspaper in Argentina, published this page about abortion, the discussion about abortion. What's interesting here, I know many of you might not understand Spanish, but what's interesting here is that all the pictures, all the photos you can see of people with an opinion about abortion all happen to be people who don't have uteruses. So they're all men having an opinion about abortion. You can see Mario Negri, who's a representative, and you can see the Minister of Science and Technology, and you can see Bishop, and they're all men giving their opinion. So this newspaper and the people who write this newspaper, who produce newspaper, said we're going to devote a whole page to the discussion on the legalization of abortion, but we're not going to invite one woman. And what's more striking to me is that the graphic designer who put together this page didn't think this looks weird. We're discussing abortion and I have 4 photos of men. I want to tell somebody about this. So this didn't call out their attention at all. And it's not that women in Argentina did not participate in the discussion about abortion. They were very, very vocal about it. There were a lot of medical doctors and sociologists and members of the feminist movement and students talking about abortion. It's only that La Nación chose to feature politicians and experts who are not women to this called out my attention so much. I didn't take a picture because I was writing this paper or anything. I took a picture because I was angry about it, and then I tweeted about it. So, but it's one of the things I like the most about research is that you get to there's sublimation for your passions. So I was angry about this, and I got to participate in the writing of a paper about it, and that made me very happy. So we're interested in who is cited as a source in Argentina. So it's the same data collection process, more than 3,000 articles. And we can see that in total, men were cited, there were 2,600 men cited, and women were cited like less than half of that. It's 1,200 times women were cited in news in Argentina. More than half of the stories had at least a man as a source. Less than 3 out of 10 stories had at least a woman as a source. In fact, there are more stories that have no sources at all than stories that have at least a woman as a source. So even when they had no sources, journalists didn't go out to look out for a source that was female. So women not only get fewer bylines, but they also get less cited as sources in news articles in Argentina. And of course, this is not uniform across beats, as you would say. It's interesting that in foreign affairs, articles had on average 1.35 male sources compared to 0.33 female sources. In business, the difference was also striking. So was in politics, in science and technology, in sports. It's interesting that the only beats topics in which in which women were more cited as sources than men were entertainment and education. And of course, there are reasons for that. Entertainment, there are women who are actresses, there are women who are singers, there are women who are TV personalities, and they get to be cited as sources, of course. And education has more women sources because usually teachers and mothers, and teacher is a very feminized profession, particularly I'd say elementary school teacher. Elementary school teacher is a very feminized profession in Argentina. Mothers are cited as sources when discussing education much more than fathers, of course, because it's supposed to be the domain of women. We're also interested in whether articles written by women had more women sources, and that's true. Yes, the proportion, at least the proportion of women's sources was higher in female bylines, but it's interesting that articles with female bylines also had more male sources. And one possibility for that is that women journalists choose to appear as more authoritative by citing more sources. So both more female sources and male sources too. Sources do not reflect the social reality they're covering, because you might say, okay, women don't get cited in politics but because there are not enough women politicians, but that's not the fact in Argentina. We have a current vice president. Our former vice president was also a woman. The president before the former president was a woman. We had a woman who was governor of the province of Buenos Aires. So Argentina has a parity law. At least 50% of candidates on proportional representation ballots must be women. This is a very recent law, but right now 41% of diputadas, representatives, and 40% of senators are women. So it's not that women don't get cited because there are not enough women working in politics, for instance. As I said, female journalists cite more sources, more female sources and more male sources. Maybe more women in the newsroom could lead to more women represented in the news. Of course, we don't know about that, but our findings support this probable implication of having more bylines, more female bylines could lead to more female sources being cited too. So what about audiences? So how does this reflect on audiences? And this is a paper. We had conducted 158 interviews. In fact, Mora had helped coordinate, Mora Matasi had helped coordinate the interviews. And we asked people about media consumption in general. And we had also conducted a survey in the greater Buenos Aires area. And what came to our attention with Pablo and with Facundo is that women read less women read the newspaper, the print newspaper, than men. So in the survey, 42% of men survey respondents said they read the print newspaper compared to 33% of women. And also we found out that older respondents, and this might not be a surprise, older respondents are more likely to read the print newspaper than younger respondents. So half of respondents over 60 read the print newspaper compared to a quarter of readers younger than adults younger than 30, and there's a very proportional relationship across ages. This relationship holds also for economic status. People of high socioeconomic status read more the print newspaper than people in low socioeconomic status. So we thought with Pablo and Facundo that class and gender and age are compounded. So and reading the newspaper was the preserve of older, white, more educated men, probably. So we had the interviews and wanted to know why. Why does this happen? And one of the things that came out first is that it's mostly men who decide what newspaper to buy. So the first quote is from a psychologist in Buenos Aires, a young psychologist in Buenos Aires, a woman who's 34 years old. And she said, my husband subscribed to Clarín and that's stuck. He reads it on Sundays. I like La Nación more, its format, the type of news it publishes. But we already get Clarín. We won't subscribe to newspapers. We don't devote that much time to reading the news. The second quote is from a photographer, a 40-year-old photographer, also in Buenos Aires. She said, I joined the Readers Club or whatever to get, she said her husband told her, I joined the Readers Club or whatever to get the 365 loyalty card. I thought it was disastrous. Being subscribed to Clarín is disastrous, and being subscribed to get the 365 card is even worse. Because I don't want to have anything to do with all these people. Clarín is part of the hegemonic media. So this person actively dislikes Clarín, and yet is the newspaper that gets to her home because it's what her husband chooses to buy to get the loyalty card or whatever. So even in young professional women in the city of Buenos Aires, in young professional marriages in the city of Buenos Aires, it's men who decide what newspaper gets bought. It's not also that they are buying it or they're deciding to buy it. It's also that they're reading it. This is from a young woman who works in finance and still live with her parents. Dad reads it. They, her parents, discuss not buying it any longer, but he loves the paper all the time. None of us, and it's nosotras in Spanish, because it's the female first person plural pronoun, reads it. We do everything on the iPad, the cell phone, the computer. And this is also an interesting quote. This is a woman who works as a cleaning lady in a house in Argentina. And she said, sometimes I grab some magazine, I read a little. The magazine that comes with Clarín or La Nación, my mister, el señor in Spanish, with people from Latin America we recognize, reads the newspaper. So the newspaper was for him and the magazine that came on Sunday was for her. And one of my favorite quotes from this research project is a woman who was 72 years old. She said, lately, now that I live alone, that my children are already out of the house, I keep myself more informed. Before, mothering activities did not allow me to keep up with the news because you have to take the kids to school, to a birthday here and there. Now that I am alone, I have a much more free time for that and I get much more informed. And I love being informed. It's like I participate more in social life. So up to, in a sense, reading the newspaper, reading the print newspaper is participating in the public sphere. And of course, public sphere and print newspapers are related as per Jürgen Habermas' works. And it's interesting that this woman recognized that it was her lack of time because of her mothering activities and taking care of the house that did not allow her to read the newspaper to be informed. So patriarchal class and compounded, women are less likely to decide what newspaper to buy within their own household, less likely to have the free time to read whichever newspaper their husbands decide to purchase, and less likely to have the means with which to purchase news in prints. As male dominance is challenged across social structures, one of the preserves of male power, the print newspaper, is also retreating. As you know, print newspapers sales are falling across the entire world, but particularly in Argentina. As with the end of patriarchy, this study shows that the demise of experience of reading print newspapers might not be altogether bad news. And I don't want to end on a sad note. I have really good news. So in 2015, in May 2015, Marcela Ojeda, who is a journalist, she's a journalist, she noticed that there were lots of crimes against women, violence against women. And she got angry and she said, actresses, politicians, artists, entrepreneurs, social activists, women, all of us, aren't we gonna raise our voices? They are killing us. And this is the tweet that started the Ni Una Menos movement. So the Ni Una Menos movement, the Not One Woman Less movement, which you might have seen in media coverage, there was a huge protest in front of Congress. They were demanding laws to curb violence against women, to help women have protection against their aggressors. It was a million people marching in front of Congress in Argentina. The laws were passed. The protests now happen every year, but this helped put violence against women in the agenda. Of course, newspapers were covering it, but they were covering as crimes of passion or something that couldn't be helped. And this tweet first, and of course the protest later had to say this is part of a systemic problem. We have to do something about this as a society. This is not like a few monsters here and there. We need to do something about this, and several laws were passed that gave women protection against their aggressors, that allowed courts to monitor aggressors' whereabouts if they were free, that forced public servants to be informed and to get classes about gender violence. It's called Ley Micaela. Micaela, of course, is a girl who was killed after going to a party. So all these changes stemmed out of this like cry for action. That was a tweet. This woman is a journalist, a professional journalist. She's recognized, but she didn't feel that the places where she worked were the would host this kind of activity. So she organized this on social media. And this kind of activism then carried on to activism of the legalization of abortion. This is a photo from, not from 2020 when abortion was legalized. There were fewer people in 2020 because of the pandemic and restrictions in everything. But this is a photo from 2018 when abortion was discussed for the first time in Congress. It passed in the lower house in the representatives, but it didn't pass in the Senate. In 2020, 2 years later, it passed both in representatives and Senate, and abortion is now legal in Argentina. You may know that green is the color of the legalization of abortion in Argentina and many other countries in Latin America. And I use this tweet and these two pictures to show that if women are not in mainstream media, they're not invited to be hosts in radio or television, and there's one woman per 6 men on cable news, there will be someone else. They will meet on social media, they will meet on the streets, and women's issues and women's human rights issues and violence against women and reproductive issues will be part of the agenda. And that if media choose not to be part of this, it's their loss. Because they will lose talent and they will lose readers and they will lose audiences. And the power of women, not only in Argentina, I could also speak about Chile and the A Rapist in Your Path song, Un Violador en Tu Camino. I could speak about the United States and the Me Too movement, when women are very much part of the public sphere and they demand to be heard, and they will take their place in the public sphere even if mainstream media fail to recognize it. So I'm sorry if I spoke too quickly. I'm very passionate about these issues. I hope this was interesting for you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Eugenia, for this amazing presentation. I really miss being in your classes. So I'd like to encourage the audience to write their questions right in the Q&A button. I would like to start with one of the questions that said, what role can the recent introduction of gender editors, editoras de género, in several Argentinian media play in the face of this lack of changes that you mentioned? How do you think that the emergence of this position could be explained?
That's a very interesting question, and I think that the intentions of hiring editoras de género or gender editors is good. It's a good intention. There's a good intent there, but I'm not sure how much it changes the, let's say, the everyday work of news. I'll give a very short example. A while ago, there was this very young woman who was working with a mayor in a city outside Buenos Aires, and she got vaccinated. And there was an outcry about why she was vaccinated, and there were suggestions that she was the mayor's lover or the mayor's girlfriend or something like that. And one very well-known journalist in Argentina said, "Oh, you know, but she's got a very lindo culito. She's got a very nice ass, literally." And this was on a cable news network in Argentina, and nobody said anything. The hosts laughed about it. It was maybe uncomfortable, but that was it. And what the cable news station decided to do is to ask their gender editor. I think she's a great journalist. I mean, I'm in awe of her, to talk with him. And the gender editor was like, it has nothing to do with the story, whether she has a nice ass or she doesn't. It's not related to the story. And the journalist kind of laughed it off, said, okay, maybe I was wrong, I don't know. So unless journalists think before saying something out the body of somebody who's in the news, I don't think the gender editor will do anything except maybe wash the media outlets' face. So of course we have journalists who say terrible things, but then we have a gender editor that kind of I'd say discusses it with them and we let it go. maybe journalists shouldn't comment on people who are in the news anatomy when it's germane to the news in case, I don't know. So I think the intentions are good, but I don't know how much it works to change like the makeup of news in Argentina. That's it.
Another question said, what relation can the role of women in the media have with respect to the percentage of women studying journalism in Argentina? Does anyone know if in Argentina, journalism is a career with a higher number of female or male students?
I'm glad to be able to answer that. I don't have like updated statistics on this, but I'm a professor in one of the, I would say, two more like well-known masters in journalism in Argentina. And I have a proportion of maybe 4 to 20. So maybe 2 to 10 of my students are men and the rest are women. So 8 out of 10 students in the masters in journalism where I teach are women. I can say the same thing for the degree in communications in San Andres. I can say the same thing for the degree in communications in Universidad de Buenos Aires or the degree in journalism Universidad de La Plata. So women are overwhelmingly the majority in both undergraduate and graduate courses of journalism. So maybe it's a matter of time. Maybe in 10 years or 20 years, there will be more women in the newsrooms or more women in television. I can also say that women were the majority in journalism courses in undergraduate and graduate level 20 years ago when I started studying. And so these proportions are not reflected in newsrooms or in bylines or in sources. But maybe the future will be different, and this time the overwhelming majority of women in university, in college, in tertiary courses of journalism will get to the newsrooms. It's, I think, one of the reasons it's so difficult for women who study journalism to make it, in the sense that to get to the newsrooms, is that if you see who are the editors, main print newspapers, they're still men. One exception to this is Infobae, which is a top-selling online, top-rated, not top-selling, top-rated online news sites in Argentina, where the editor is a woman. But if you see who are the editors in print newspapers, who are the news managers, gerentes de noticias, general producers in cable news, they're still mostly men. So women do work as producers and journalists, but the top honchos, to say it informally, they're still mostly men. So maybe when more women get to positions of power, more women will be cited as sources, and maybe we won't need gender editors. We don't need like gender editors for men. So maybe in a few years, we won't need gender editors because there will be enough women working in positions of power that we don't have to check. And men who still work in positions of power will have, I know, adapted their work to the idea of gender equality, and we won't need a woman checking whether what men or women say is okay, and then, I don't know, like upbraiding them about it. Just an idea.
Another question said, can you comment on the Neus case where the victim and the Hercule were buried together?
Yes, for those who don't know, Jorge Neus was a very well-known entrepreneur. He was in Argentina, and he and his wife appeared. No, his wife appeared. The woman who worked in their house heard shots, and she couldn't open the door to their bedroom, and finally the son came and they opened the door, and his wife was, and I'm very ashamed of this, but I don't remember the name of his wife. I just remember his name, but his wife was dead, and he was very severely wounded, and the news was covered, and the whole idea was that they had a discussion. First they said that there was a suicide pact, because they were very sad about one of their children, I don't know. And they said, no, they had a discussion, and the family hurried up and had like a burial ceremony for the two of them together with a picture, you know, the typical picture you put in burial ceremonies of them hugging, like side to side, like they were friends. And when the district attorney intervened, it was shown that they had had a discussion, that they had not spent the night together, and when she came home to get her clothes and things to leave the house, he was waiting for her with a gun, and he ambushed her in the bedroom and he killed her. But all that came out after, of course, they were buried. And the feeling I get, or the idea I got from that particular story, which was then covered extensively by the news, I have to say, like the gender violence angle was later covered extensively by the news, was that the family was like I would say, high-class family in Argentina didn't want to make waves. So they said, okay, no, they had a fight. She was sad. There was a suicide pact. I don't know anything. Instead of accepting, maybe because it's very hard to accept, I couldn't imagine being in the skin of those people, estar en la piel de esa gente, as we would say in Spanish, that your father killed your mother and then he committed suicide. So I think that's an interesting, I would say, topic where, as in print newspapers, patriarchy and class are compounded. So what explains the coverage of the initial coverage, because after the district attorney reached these conclusions, the coverage took very much the gender angle. And one thing that was especially, I would say, heartbreaking for me is that in Argentina, well, in our countries too, but print newspapers still publish like obituaries, like people saying, I'm so sorry, or let's pray for them, or whatever. And most of the obituaries had them together. And not only they had them together, but also they had her as Silvia. Her name was Silvia. I remember now her last name was De Neus. So in Argentina, some women, not all of them, are increasingly fewer, take their husband's surname. And not only they use their surname, but they use their own surname, like Silvia González De Neus. So it's like she still belonged to him, even in death. She was an object of him. And now I had never noticed this, but if you've read Handmaid's Tale, handmaids are called of Fred, of Hank, of Henry. And it's kind of the same idea. This woman was Sylvia, her last name of Neus, and that's how she was remembered in the obituaries, even if her husband had killed her, which is pretty tragic.
This was, yeah, terrific. So another question said, what are the bottlenecks? What explains the persistence of the pattern in the newsrooms you mentioned, especially in light of what you discussed in the last part of the presentation? Is the sailing glass in management position? Thank you for your representation.
It could be a ceiling glass issue, and it could also be that because we're observing mostly legacy media, except Infobae, which is online only, it could be that women choose to work somewhere else, that they choose to work in online only news sites, that they, for instance, there's a feminist news site which is called LatFem, which employs mostly women. So it could be that women are deciding, or go work for technology companies, or go work for Facebook, or so it could be both the ceiling and also women saying, you don't want me here, I don't want to be here either, that's fine, I can go and have a great career somewhere else. So I think that's why one of the risks is that mainstream news media or legacy news media are not only losing readers, they are losing talent, and in losing talent, they are losing readers, and also they're being like left out of the story. So the Ni Una Menos movement was only covered by mainstream news media when 1 million people were present in front of the Congress protesting. But they said almost nothing about it in advance. It flew completely under the radar. People who were on social media, particularly on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, they knew, but it flew under the radar for mainstream news media. And I read and I saw like very serious and solemn opinion columnists and editors saying that abortion would never be approved in Argentina, that because the Pope is Argentinian, the Pope is, of course, Jorge Bergoglio, the artist also known as Francisco I, because the Pope was Argentinian, abortion would never be legalized in Argentina, and that was not a possibility, and that the president was doing this, but then in the end, the Senate would vote against it. what my friends in the feminist movement were telling me, it's a done deal. They were like, it's going to happen in 2020. Don't worry. It would have never been sent to Congress if it wasn't possible that it would be approved. So they're not only like being left out of picture, they're also losing the story. They let their bias like dictate their analysis. So I think it makes them lose readers, but it also makes them lose like touch with reality.
Another question said, what do you imagine the situation would be like if the newspaper observed was Página 12, which has both supplements on feminism and on sexuality, has been very much aligned with the New Ana Menos movement, etc.?
In fact, Página 12 was observed in the first research from 95 to 2015. It was Clarín and Página 12. And it used slightly more an equality frame and slightly more a thematic frame for articles about gender violence and sexual and reproductive health, but it was still not the majority. So it was a little bit better than Clarín, but not that much. You could say Las 12 already has like 15 years at least, or 16 years. And it's interesting to note, and Página 12 was also one of the articles of one of the newspapers observed for the research on bylines and sources. So, and we didn't find any differences there with the other newspapers. So maybe it's because Las 12 and Soy, which is the article on sexuality, which is the supplement on sexuality, and I really like Las 12 and I really like Soy, so it's not a criticism. But I also get the feeling that sources and bylines, like in the main parts of the newspaper, they're still men, and they have these very good supplements, but women are still like siloed. Women and alternative sexualities are siloed in these two very good supplements, but you know the newspaper is still mostly because I can of course, Irina Hauser, she's a journalist at Página 12, and she's great and I love what she does and everything, but sources continue to be men and bylines continue to be men. Maybe we conducted this research from 95 to 2015 dealing with the print newspaper, and and in 2017 for the online sources research, and maybe this has changed from 2017 to now, but we did include Página 12 and it didn't change much. For instance, one of the things we noticed in Página 12 is that it used more the thematic frame than the episodic frame to discuss gender violence. And I think that's mostly the merit of Mariana Carvajal, who is also a journalist in Página 12 and who also covered many of these articles. But I can name them like with my fingers. So Irina House and Mariana Carvajal, but it's not like a general thing I'd say in the newspaper. Maybe it is in the supplements, and we don't get to analyze the supplements because their articles are not published online as prominently as they are seen in the supplement. But still, it's interesting that they have to use a supplement like for women's views. And I remember when I was maybe 21 or 22, I bought Página 12. I was, of course, a Página 12 reader. I was studied at the Facultad de Ciencias Sociales of la Universidad de Buenos Aires. And a boyfriend I had at the time said, "This is great. I get to read Página 12 and you get to read Las 12." And he was joking about it because we were very, very much feminist, both of them. But I still felt, yeah, why do you need a supplement for women's views? It's not that you call Página 12 like Los 12 or whatever. Like it's for men. So that's something I'm usually like in two minds about.
Another question wonders if there's some sort of destructive feedback loop going on where women are not consumer of news, so news are not created for women as an audience, so women are not consumer on news and so on. And related to this, do you think that owners of the principal newspapers in Argentina don't have many women writing in their main sections, such as economics or politics, because they fear to lose their main audience, which is white men?
That's an interesting question, and I think there's definitely like a feedback loop there. I would say like a spark of silence. So you don't get women, and then women don't read the newspaper, and because women don't read the newspaper or don't listen to the radio or don't choose the cable news channel at home, then you have to have men opining on things or giving their opinion on things, because men won't be like, I don't know, like turned away from the news because of having women opining there. So maybe there's a feedback loop. I'm not sure about the owners of print newspapers. Like, I don't think the owner or the corporation that owns Clarín has like opinions about whether women should be there or not. One of the things I feel is that if it works, let's have women. But I think it's like more like a second level decision, like maybe made by the CEOs or the people who are running the newspapers, who they call their friends. So when journalists are sourcing an article, they call the people they know, and male journalists know more male sources, like the All Boys Club and that kind of thing. And the same thing happens when a newspaper, when the editor in chief of a newspaper decides he's gonna assign beats to, or who's he gonna call to work in the newspaper. So he knows more men and he calls more men, and so it's kind of also like a feedback loop. And then women choose not to read the newspaper, but it's still making men making the decisions. And of course, there's a huge literature about who decides what to watch at home on television and what to say on the radio. And in these interviews, we can see, and this is a work that's been done with a colleague in Japan, Kaori, and she finds that we find this is a very large project with our countries, that it's very usual for men to decide what to watch on in the home, what radio to listen to in the car, mostly because they're also the ones that are driving. So maybe it's this, if it's still going to be men who decide what to watch, and what to read and what to listen to, let's give them men, and that will keep them happy. I'm not sure. And one of the things that I think is different on social media is that it's mostly conducted on personal devices. So most interaction with the social media is on cell phones. And that's like, you don't share your cell phone, you don't have to reach an agreement with someone else, like with the man of the house, and what we're going to do on a cell phone. So it's interesting that we don't see this kind of thing on social media, where each individual, be it male or female, can decide who to follow, who to repost, who to share, who to like, etc. So yes, maybe there's a feedback loop, but I'd like to say it's a destructive feedback loop, not only for women who get to participate in the public sphere in other ways, but also for media companies who are losing like half their possible readership.
If the data allow you to see this, have you encountered an example of news outlets that were outliers, that in fact did a good job or better job with gender equality or in violence or in sources?
I'm pretty sure there are. I mentioned LatFem, which is definitely an outlier. And if we looked only at Las 12, which is a women's supplement in Página 12, or Soy, which is like the sexuality, alternative sexualities issue supplement on Página 12, we will surely find this. But it's interesting that we chose to do this research on 8 mainstream news sites. So if you go out of the mainstream, you will find outliers. But in the mainstream, there were no outliers.
All right, last question. Did the interviews talk about what you mentioned at the end about the use of alternative media for getting information or discussing issues important to them?
The interviews talked about social media, and in the survey, we also found that women used more social media than men. So yes, this was not the topic of this article, but we did work on this on papers with Pablo and with Mora. Use of social media is, of course, not as a disparate between men and women, but women still use more social media, and women in particularly use social media to communicate with others and to organize things. And like, we saw a lot of that in WhatsApp. There's a paper I recommend by Mora Matas, is the first author, Domesticating WhatsApp, where we can see how women like domesticate and use social media to keep up their social lives and their family lives. So yes, we saw in the interviews that women are very enthusiastic, I would say, taker-uppers of social media, much more so than print newspapers.
All right, perfectly on time. This has been quite amazing. We have 9 seconds more to go. Incredible content, great interaction, perfectly timed. Thank you so much, Eugenia. This has been spectacular. I don't have enough adjectives, and I'm biased, but still it has been spectacular. Thank you so much, Facundo, for great moderation. Thanks everybody in the audience for staying with us to the end. And I invite you to join us next week when Magdalena Saldaña from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile will present her work in the weekly seminar of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.